Look, I think we ought to be able to have frank, candid discussions. You know, there was a time in this country where you could have differences of opinion and you could discuss, dialogue, you can have debate. And these were the kinds of things that we debated. We debated policies. You know, should you be wearing a mask if you're vaccinated? You know, you have a right to question that. But now what we see is this is not liberalism. This is the left. I'm fine with liberals. I don't agree with them, but I'm fine with them because they don't want to silence people. The classic modern liberal, you know, you can have a debate. They could try to support their ideas, their policies, but the left, because they're driven by this Marxist socialism, in many cases, what we see today, they can't defend it, not up against what we have. And so they don't want to be exposed. And so what do? They silence. That's what they do. They silence. In fact, I want to play a clip. I didn't get to play this in the last segment. I wanted to because it pertains to Senator Johnson. But this is Gavin Newsom. And this is right out of the Rules for Radicals, Saul Alinsky's book about marginalizing. Let's play that clip of Gavin Newsom.
But we are exhausted, respectfully, exhausted by the ideological prism that too many Americans are living under. We're exhausted by the Ron Johnsons and the Tucker Carlsons. We're exhausted by the Marjorie Taylor Greens. We're exhausted by the right-wing echo chamber that has been perpetuating misinformation around the vaccine and its efficacy and safety. We're exhausted by the politicalization of this pandemic, and that includes mask wearing.
You know why they're exhausted is because they can't defend their position, and they can't mentally come up with a logical reason to confront those who have a different view. And so what do? They have to silence. That's what's happening. That's why when they seek to silence, we have to stand up and speak civilly, respectfully, but vocally and loudly. All right, if you're a longtime Washington Watch listener, or even one that's heard a few episodes more recently, you've noticed that we're covering a lot of news coming out of China, as the threats coming out of there pose a significant threat to the entire world, and particularly in America, in what they are doing. Now, I want to bring in Frank Gaffney. He is the founder and executive chairman of the Center for Security Policies, joining us by phone. They have a new report out that covers what is happening in China with their Belt and Road program, which is going out all across America, all across the world, enticing other governments in. It's very subtle, but very dangerous. And I've asked Frank to join us to talk about it. Frank, thanks so much for joining us today.
Tony, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me. And just a small correction for the record. This is a product of another group that I work with called the Committee on the Present Danger China. And it's Captive Nations Coalition. And it's not so subtle what's going on, unfortunately, if you just look at it or look for it. Unfortunately, most of us are so busy with other things that we've neglected the phenomenon. You know, Tony, it's been often observed that the frog in a pot of water that is cold and incrementally gets ratcheted up boils just like one that doesn't have that experience, but it's just a lot slower and incremental, and that's what the Chinese have been doing with what really I think amounts to a colonial empire-building operation they call the Belt and Road Initiative. And this study, which is entitled China's Dream, the World's Nightmare, how the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, is colonizing and enslaving the planet, is really about how that pot of water has been incrementally turned up in now 140 of the roughly 195 countries around the world that have Chinese, not just influence operations, which is pretty much a global pandemic, as you know, but the actual arrangements to build out infrastructure or to give the Chinese privileged access to natural resources or markets, and in many cases to do so under conditions that inevitably translate into essentially foreclosure when so-called debt trap financing can't be sustained by the countries in question. So it's a very long-term, comprehensive effort to dominate the planet, Tony, and I salute you and this program for the attention that you're paying to the Chinese Communist Party. We all have to, and this is just another facet of what they're up to that is a mortal peril, I think, to the free world.
The Chinese Communist Party's efforts to achieve world domination by building an empire through massive debt trap financed overseas investments and commercial transactions. It's been dubbed the Belt and Road Initiative, and it's in about 140 of the world's countries. Frank, thanks so much for sticking around. As you explained, that this debt trap finance basically means if they don't pay for it, the Chinese government gets to take over part of the country's property, the infrastructure. This gives them access to controlling those countries. Is that right?
It does, Tony, and that's the problem. It's kind of like payday loans. Those are arrangements that you can predict people are simply not going to be able to make payments on. And when that happens, in this case, the Chinese Communist Party can foreclose. And the really frightening prospect of much of that is when you look at them taking over ports or taking over airfields or rail networks or roadways, right, or mines for critical materials and minerals, that can become power projection capability for the Chinese People's Liberation Army, which again threatens not just the countries most immediately involved, but their neighbors and perhaps us as well.
One final question for you. What is so troubling to me, I mean, that's troubling on its face, in reality, I mean, that's troubling. But in many cases, this is being financed from U.S. and other Western capital markets.
Yes. That's so true. And most of us, I suspect, even among your listeners, are unaware that their investment dollars, perhaps their pension funds or funds they might have in index funds or exchange-traded funds or mutual funds, because Wall Street has been so determined, not everybody, but a lot of the big houses have been determined to do business with China. Why? Because, among other things, they make a huge commission. You may not make so much money, but they make huge commissions doing business with China. And in many cases, Tony, as you know, that translates into not only underwriting Chinese Communist Party-controlled companies, but in some cases, the People's Liberation Army's companies. In every case, it is empowering, it is enabling, and it is emboldening our most mortal enemy in our nation's history, the Chinese Communist Party.
It's unbelievable, but it's happening. Frank Gaffney, always great to talk with you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, my friend.
Frank Gaffney with the Center for Security.